Tonight we are happy to welcome back to the Athenaeum Chard deNiord, and it is with great pleasure at this time that we can celebrate his appointment as the Vermont Poet Laureate. Chard was the son of a doctor and began school heading in that direction, following in his father's footsteps. But he was introduced to theology and decided to study religion. He holds a Master's of Divinity. Before being ordained, he worked as a psychiatric aide, and eventually he pursued poetry full-time, earning his MFA in 1985. He is a writer, a teacher, and the co-founder of the New England College MFA program in poetry. He has written 5 books of poetry and has also authored a book of essays and interviews with renowned poets called Sad Friends, Drowned Lovers, Stapled Songs, Reflections and Conversations with 20th Century American Poets, among which include Robert Bly, Lucille Clifton, Donald Hall, Galway Canal, and Maxim Cuden. As with many poets, Chard finds inspiration for his poetry through life experience. In an interview with Brian Brodeur in 2010, he talks about his poem, An Incident at the Catholic Worker. It was published about 24 years after working at the Catholic Worker in New York, and it was based on an incident that actually happened. It was a somewhat violent incident. And most of the beginning of the poem recounts the experience. Through many revisions, he said he finally decided to conclude with a rather fictional account of what happens to the main person in the poem. In his words, I realized that I had to find a fictional truth that was truer than the truth, to turn this otherwise journal entry into a poem with a mythic conceit. This is one of the few narrative poems in which I have fictionalized the ending so dramatically. I wait for such opportunities to transcend happeningness with a more memorable and true alternative that divines a grounding reality and an imaginative leap that both suspends the disbelief of my reader and enlightens him or her, as well with an original, truth-telling lie. We look forward tonight for him to suspend and enlighten us this evening. Chard is currently a professor of English at Providence College. He lives in Westminster, West Vermont, and he will be reading from his new book, Interstate, and other recent work. At this time, I'd like to welcome Chard.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Shara, and thank you all for coming. It's a great joy to read here at any time of the year, to stand in front of this magnificent landscape without feeling I'm going to be drenched any second, but that would be okay. So I can't think of a more beautiful place to read in the entire country, actually. I'm going to, as Shara mentioned, I'm going to read from this new book, Interstate, which just came out last fall, and I guess I'll have to read that Catholic Worker poem also. There's a friend of mine here tonight who was with me when I first met Dorothy Day in Virginia, who founded the Catholic Worker, and it's so great he's here from New Mexico. It's just a coincidence. Michael Johnson and Ellen, his wife. So I'll read that. But I thought I would start with a poem called Night Mowing from a previous book. Because I heard Reeve Lindbergh talking about haying before I came in, and she completely threw me off. I was going to read all this. I have this strategy for this evening of reading a poem about people and then some animals and people, but now I'm going to have to read this. You know, just you're on your way to some place, you hear something, and you have to drop everything and do that. And it's good that your plans are thrown into chaos that way. Night mowing. This has a little epigraph. Memory is a kind of accomplishment by William Carlos Williams, which it certainly is. You know, Vermont farmers mow at night, you know, probably because they're busy, too busy during the day to mow, and they get on my neighbor, Ed Temple, gets on his old farm mower, which is about this high, and mows until about 2 in the morning, keeps me up, but it's a kind of lullaby at the same time. I remember the drone of Francis Temple's farm all mowing in the dark of a mid-September night. Its deep, desultory blasts were also guttural, half motor, half cat, as it labored in the meadow back and forth, felling hay in 6-foot rows with a sickle bar that rattled like a snake. The memory of that mowing grows in my mind, which is also a field that's overgrown with every weed and type of grass. No less real than the tractor itself, mowing in the dark. I wake with a start to the sound of that engine, the same old farm-all I heard as a boy, so that I'm forever waking and remembering at the same time to the accompaniment of a tractor I cannot see in the meadow, but know is there, as it is tonight. Moving forward, growing newer instead of older, as it takes me back in its moving forward down the rows of waist-high hay that fall like hair against the earth. So, as I mentioned earlier, this new book you often have no idea what you're writing or what order you're putting the poems in, and I realized that there's a pattern in this book in which I write about animals, and then I write about people, and there's a kind of dialectic that I'm pursuing almost unconsciously. So I just thought I would. It's kind of a risk. See how that sounds in a particular order. I'll start with a poem called Small Black Eye. A sparrow lay stunned but still alive in the periwinkle, a victim of the window that appears as air in the kingdom of birds. I picked her up and placed her wing against my face as she came around. All the world, sky, grass, trees, shone inside her small black eye that was perfectly still as it stared at me, like a stone that could see. So this is I'm moving now to a person. This is called Anchorite in Autumn. Do you all know what an anchorite is? You know what an anchorite is? Rachel knows what an anchorite is. An anchorite is a medieval, usually referred to, although they're present day anchorites, but they're usually referred to as medieval, mainly female mystics who lived in niches in churches and would give advice. And lived there throughout their lives. Julian of Norwich was a mystic. Catherine of Aragon was a mystic, an anchorite. So this is Anchorite in Autumn. She rose from bed and coughed for an hour, entered her niche that was also her shower, shaved her legs with Occam's razor, rinsed her hair with holy water, opened the curtain that was double layered, slipped on her robe in the widening gyre, gazed in the mirror with gorgeous terror, took out a cigarette and held it like a flower, lit it devoutly like the wick of a pyre, smoked like a thurible in the grip of a friar, stared out the window at the leaves on fire, fire, fire. starlings. The maple outside the window was alive with birdsong, but the birds were hidden behind the leaves, so the tree itself appeared to be singing a loud, cacophonous song. They rose en masse like the shadow of a cloud with the emptiness they left calling back to them with the fullness of where they had been. Like the tree before this and the tree before that. They sang ecstatically as if it were morning, although the sky was heavy with evening, and you could hear the silence in the sky beyond their singing. I think Chard mentioned that I'd worked on a mental health ward for 5 years after my experience at Divinity School, which I did at the Connecticut Mental Health Center in New Haven. And I worked for 3 years at that hospital on an inpatient unit, which was also a research unit where blood and urine had to be collected every day. And on my last day on the job there, I decided to turn the urinal table into a bar. And I told all of the patients whom I loved that we were going to have happy hour that day. I stood behind the table of urinals on evening shift, my last day on the job, and turned this ward into a bar. Patients stared at me from the lounge and almost smiled. "Listen up," I said, "it's happy hour. All drinks are free." "You're as crazy as we are," Robert said. Nancy laughed like a chickadee. "What'll it be?" I asked. Rhoda was on an upswing, walking like a penguin down the hall. "Give me a screwdriver," she said, "to tighten my screws." "Coming right up," I said. "I'm NPO for ECT, my dear. Better not. I'm getting the hangover that lasts a year." I asked Kenny if he wanted a gin and catatonic. Not funny, suddenly quiet. I was at an altar now instead of a bar. How about a lemonade or sarsaparilla? He stood as still as a mannequin against the wall and stared at something so far away it came too close to him. Alex stopped his pacing in front of the bar and stared at me. I pictured a worm devouring his brain like so many leaves. "I'll take a daiquiri," he said, the first thing he'd said in days. I poured him a glass of air, which he took and thanked me for and drank, then handed back the empty glass. I poured one for me and held it high. "L'chaim," I said, "to you all. And also to you," Rhoda chimed. "We'll miss you, dear." I drank as Alex did in a single swig, then put my goblet down on the bar and smelled that smell that was also mine. This is an older poem I've been reluctant to include in a book or to read, but I finally did. It's called Prodigal Time. You know, pigs have this terrible reputation for being crazy. You know, the kerosene demoniac and the pigs going over the cliff. But they're wonderfully ecstatic creatures and mysterious. This actually happened in Iowa when I was out there. It's not that, I guess it does matter that it's a true story in some ways. Prodigal Time. The pigs were happy to see us outside their pen. Yorkshires with mud-caked skin and corkscrew tails that curled and straightened like party favors. They strained in looking up, cocked for rooting, bent on rutting. One opened his mouth for a swig of beer. I missed his tongue and splashed his nose. A boar behind him squealed like a jet just touching down, angry at his position. The one up front licked it off with a smacking noise, grunting from his core, deep as diesel, set off by that smell of urine, hops, and rotting swill. then moved behind in a violent sneeze, aroused, arching his back for compact thrust into the hole of fetid air, spilling his seed, then sprinting away from the sows who ran inside, one pissing on her way, a steady wide stream that streamed in a saffron cloud. I had a terrible frozen shoulder a few years ago. Do you know what that is? When your joint just freezes for no reason, apparently. I guess you're doing something to it that you shouldn't be without being aware. And then you just can't move your shoulder. The synovial fluid just jams up. So I went to this therapist who tortured me for 4 months and fixed it, but with great pain. So this is called the pain. So back to a person here. Pain has an element of blank, Emily Dickinson wrote. Quietly, almost secretly, I drove to my therapist for treatment on my frozen shoulder, left my shoes at her door, and entered the treatment room on the second floor of her converted house that was also her office on Main Street. Once inside, I spoke another language in my native English about the pain I felt, how sharp and dull it was at the same time, how subtly it had grown from a minor injury I never noticed into full-blown adhesive encapsulitis. I lay supine on the table and did as she said, breathe into your shoulder, Chard, as if saying my name would empower me to do such a thing. I imagined my shoulder as a lung and grew short of breath as she stretched my arm behind my head, then tried to explain, I'm creating space in the capsule that's grown cluttered and stuck with the sticky stuff that tissue makes when the joint freezes up. And suddenly, I was an astronaut inside my capsule, with tubes attached to my helmet and visor aglow with the lights of the console and my Apollo rocket. I tried to breathe deeper to lessen the pain, but was grounded there on my practice beer with only my mind for a booster, in agony for fuel. I felt the rumble of my slow initial liftoff into the blue that quickens to the black of space where I floated like an embryo, breathing into a tank that suffed and clicked, gazing down at the earth that was my shoulder, spinning around inside its capsule of synovial clouds. I was a visionary in the grip of pain, divining a logic of ridiculous claims. Because the earth was my shoulder, I was the universe with infinite joints. Hardly had I thought this when I felt compelled to repeat it out loud. Because the earth is my shoulder, I am the universe with infinite joints. That's so poetic, she said. You must be a poet. No, I replied, such thinking is merely an anodyne, which is to say that I believe everyone in pain is on the verge of becoming a poet. Your range of mobility has improved, she said, by 5 degrees, which was the precise distance outside my window between Jupiter and Mars, but I said nothing then. Yeah, thank you. I had a student at the Putney School when I taught there in the 90s who had incredible awareness and could see things. You know how children and teenagers can find 4-leaf clovers and you can't anymore for some reason. Anyway, I came upon her and she was just staring up at the sky, and I thought that she was maybe on something, but she begged me to look up and to see what she was seeing. And I looked and looked and I didn't see a darn thing. And that's where the poem begins. It's called The Geese. And it has another epigraph. An unfinished point set in a vast surrounding. It's from Walt Whitman. Look, said the girl who saw things. Where? I asked. I see nothing. 12 o'clock, a dozen V's like threads, you have to look. then suddenly there, straight up, like floaters in the blue, 12 chevrons scissoring the veil, too distant to hear, although I did, and not only hear, but see as well, clear, unquenchable fire on the wings of those at the lead. You also, I said, are among them, in line, aflame, fluid and effusing, curiously floating. See how quickly they vanish, he said, at the sound of our voices. And then they were gone, like flames that had burned a hole in the sky and passed right through. I shop at the Putney Co-op. You've been to the Putney Co-op? There are co-ops all over Vermont, and great co-ops. At any rate, I was thinking of Allen Ginsberg's wonderful poem, This Supermarket in California, and why hasn't anybody written a poem about being at the co-op in Vermont? And so I took it on as a challenge, and I called it an opera. At the Putney Co-op in opera. And there's an epigraph from Ginsberg here. Well, we stroll dreaming of the lost America of love, past blue automobiles and driveways, home to our silent cottage. See, I don't know if people know that those lines are from at the supermarket in California. They are, though. So let's see. Do you need to know anything about? No, I think that everything's clear enough here. Go ahead, I say to my neighbor at the Putney Co-op, who tells me he can't complain. Let it out. It's mid-March, and there's still 2 feet of snow on the ground. Fukushima has just melted down, and the Washington Monument cracked at its pyramidion. Put down your bags and sing. How many times, dear Father Graybeard, lonely old courage teacher, must you walk down the aisles as a Randy Edelin humming your tunes for us to start? Our song begins in silence and grows to a buzz. We make it up as we go along, then watch our numbers swell. 10,000 members who have eyes to see and ears to hear, who fly like a swarm to join us in our chambers, which are these aisles. I'm singing without knowing it, carrying the tune of Main Things, lamenting the prices with Bernie Sanders. My neighbor joins me for no other reason than singing along as a member of the cast we call the multitudes of lonely shoppers. I roam the aisles with the sadness of America, juggling onions, blessing the beets. It's a local stage on which the country opens like a flower that no one sees beside the road. In my hungry fatigues, I'm shopping for images which are free on the highest shelf but costly in their absence, the only ingredient here that heals my sight of blindness. I see you, Walt Whitman, pointing your beard toward Axis Mundi by the avocados, reading the labels as if they were lines weighing the tomatoes on the scale of your palms, pressing the pears with your thumbs the way you did in Huntington, Camden, and Brooklyn. And you also, Ruth and Hayden, at the checkout counter with empty bags you claim are full of apples, almonds, and bananas. What can you say to those outside who haven't read your poems, who find it hard to get the news from poetry, but die miserably every day for lack of what is found there? It's night. The Connecticut slips by across Route 5. The moon is my egg, and stars my salt. I score the music of the carrots, scallions, and corn in the frost of the freezer windows. The sough of traffic on 91 washes my ears with the sound of tires on blue macadam. The doors close in an hour. We'll both be lonely when we return on the long, dark roads to our silent houses. I touch your book and dream of our odyssey westward to a field in Oregon, Kansas, or California, where we plant our oars and die ironically, where we finish our journey as strangers in our native land. These are the lyrics to our song in the aisles, the buzz of the swarm with our queen at the center. What America did you have, old howler, when you scattered into the sky, then floated like a cloud as another form in the making outside of time, forgetful at last and empty of all you sang. Just going to read a few more here. I think I'll read this poem about encountering a deer halfway down to our meadow, where I made eye contact with this beautiful creature, and then, you play that stare game, who's going to blink first or bolt or run away. And of course the deer usually does. But I wonder about, I just wonder about what the deer is thinking or not thinking, or is it just fear? Is it some apprehension? So halfway down this path to the meadow, halfway down, the sight of a doe through the trees in the meadow. I stopped to stare at her, staring at me. The silence arced between us like a wire, in a current that equaled strangeness over time. And since her stare was wild, so charged with fear, the moment froze on the line of sky and field, man and deer. She broke our stillness in her flight from me. I stood alone, but double then, as the man on the path and the memory of the man she carried with her beyond the meadow, into the next meadow, and the meadow after that, where she returned my image to the field of her forgetting, in which I roamed like a deer myself, remembering. Some of you are familiar with Maxine Cumin's poetry. She was a good friend, lived over there in New Hampshire, where I worked at this program for a while. And she, built her farm or house, or lived on a farm that was on this hill. Her father always told her never buy a house on a hill, but she did anyway. And she loved to tell that story about disobeying her father. Even when she was like 80, she loved to tell that story. So that's the way she was. She was very ornery. I once showed her a poem, take 3 or 4 lines. I thought it was a pretty good little lyric, maybe 6 lines. She looked at it like this, and then she looked up at me, and then she looked back down at it, and she said, "Chard, this is exactly what gives poetry a bad name." And I just loved her for it, So she worked over there at that program for a while. Anyway, so I'm dedicating this poem to Maxine because she just worked so hard, and she was so tough, and she was so talented. She broke her neck in that accident, that carriage accident, and her whole spine was fused for about 20 years. But she never complained, and she just kept writing and working on that, living on that farm on the hill, taking care of her horses. So I'm calling this I called this, I guess it's too late to change it, By the Sweat of My Face. And I'll just read this and maybe one more after this, maybe 1 or 2 at the most after this. So I should warn you, I put my name in this poem, but I hope it makes sense. Named after a vegetable, so sometimes that works. My real name's Richard. My mother gave me that name because she didn't want to call me Ricky or Dick or, Chuck or something. So I had to learn to live with it. And everybody thinks I'm French. But I'm glad she did now. I made a list for each day, which was enough, since I was inclined to do too much in a single day, more than a dozen men sometimes in a couple of days. So drawn to work and blessed with strength, I couldn't imagine paradise without it, much less remember the bliss that idlers canonized as myth more real than the history of days. Fix the bridge, weed the beans, till the corn, plant some chard. I wrote in the box of my birthday, which in the rule of night became an order for that day, like all the other days that authorized my sleep to grant me another day, as long as I saw the ruse of difference between each thing. Then woke with a charge of putting my mind to the dream, which was my work in the garden, the plot that needed me, and not the other in rows of text that merely bloomed. To be the genius of my own patch with only so many days to plant, grow, and reap. So I gathered my tools at dawn and headed down to the field and jacked the bridge that had fallen in the rains, placed a stone the ground had made 1,000,000 years ago for this repair beneath a beam that had lost its hold on the opposite bank. Weeded the beans until it was time to rest, then sat for a while in the shade of a willow beside the stream. Thought about nothing until it was something as part of the whole that was also whole for being connected to the most unlikely things: ant, pokeweed, mullein, worm. Stuck my head in the stream like a lure for the big one that always gets away. Walked back to the garden to till the corn, only to find the corpse of a mouse inside the case that houses the machine. Back up then to fetch the ratchet and a little shroud to bury her in. Slower this time than before, and grievous now. One dead at least, and maybe more from catching against the screen when I pulled the cord and it pulled back. Poor mousie, I cried like Burns. I should have guessed some creature was there after finding a snake last year wound round and round the sprocket like another cord. So many dead inside the tiller. So much work recovering the bodies. House, housing, mouse, bridge, fountain, snake. I thought like the sky, whose clouds erase its blues so perfectly. Like the dirt that smells of the whole and everything in it. Words were all. They came to me like birds to a tree, and I wrote them down for nothing with a trowel for the stars to scan as nothing also. So much nothing at the end of the day. I called it Darling, Darling. So I guess I have to read that Catholic worker poem. Almost forgot. Let's see. It's right here. This takes place in 1973, or was it 4? I think. And Dorothy Day, who founded the Catholic Worker, was there. A wonderful, incredible woman. And people used to say to Dorothy, you're going to be canonized as saint. The Pope's going to canonize you. And she'd say, I don't want it to be dismissed so easily. So that House of Hospitality, she founded in New York City, and then she had the farm community up in Tivoli, where my wife and I, lived for about 3 or 4 months. And it was just a chaotic place, but it was like anybody could come and live there. And so it was wonderfully diverse. There were artists, there were poor people, there were people from the mental hospital at Hudson State, there were old Catholic workers who had lived there since the 40s. So this was an incident that actually took place, and as Shara mentioned, I fictionalized it to tell a truth, I think, greater than what actually happened. Sitting in peace in the dining room of the country community house one Sunday morning, reading the paper about the latest truce in Israel, I heard a disturbance in the living room. People were scurrying and yelling, "Watch out, he's got a knife," and "Put her down." Then Kenny, the epileptic from Hudson Valley, appeared at the door with a little dog in one hand and a cleaver in the other. He said he was going to take the dog up the hill and throw her in the well. He said he was tired of how the people in the community were treating him, and he had to kill the dog in order to change their attitude. He had a crazed look in his eye, while the dog hung limp, Mrs. Smith's terrier. I followed him up the hill while the others prayed below. I said, "Kenny, what good do you think this will do? What good do you think this will do? They'll only take you back to the hospital." Then it was there interposed a fit, and he dropped the dog beside the well and fell to the ground and cut himself with a flailing blade. I stepped on the hand that held the knife and watched him twist like a snake with its neck pinned down. He frothed at the mouth and swallowed his tongue. I tried to stick my finger in and pull it out, but he clenched his teeth in a human vice. I thought in retrospect I could have cut a hole in his throat with a knife, but he was writhing to the end, turning blue. I watched his ghost shut down his skin, then disappear inside the well. I held the body as a souvenir of the fallen world and thought no less of him. The little dog began to bark from the edge of the woods. "Shut up," I yelled, "shut up," and almost felt what Kenny felt as he held the dog above the well and dangled it like the angry god who'd crossed a wire inside his head. It was his hatred for the little dog that had set him off, just its yapping every night in Mrs. Smith's adjacent room. He had been treated kindly by everyone according to the wishes of our saintly mother, Dorothy Day, who had always said, "Treat every stranger as if he were the Christ." Well, I thought I would leave you with a very short poem called simply Dispatch from Putney. I really live in Westminster West, but Putney is where I worked for many years, and I actually live right on the border. It doesn't sound so the same either to say dispatch from Westminster West, does it? No. All morning, the air whispered things I might forget. As I sat listening to the silence beyond the drone of the apple sprayer, a voice so small it spoke like a prayer with instruction for hearing myself as someone else. Put down your pen and pick up a stick. See how clearly it writes in the dirt. What did you think? That you weren't the farthest point from yourself? That silence runs out of ink? Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Great pleasure to be here. And if any of you have a question, I'd be happy to answer it if I can.
Does a Putney School really have to have many members?
No. I exaggerated a little bit. Putney only has like 1,500 people in our whole town. But it's an amazing little town. It has this art venue now called Next Stage, has Yellow Barn, has the co-op. Amazing. Yeah. Well, yeah.
Maxine Coonan never have a poem read a poem of yours that she liked?
I think so. I hope so. She'd smile occasionally, when I'd read something. But yeah, she was from that. She was from a very tough generation. She didn't believe in handing out compliments too readily, but so when she did, it really meant a huge amount. We've kind of lost that now, I think, a little bit.
Would you like to think of the opera as being sung?
Yeah, I'm thinking of the speaker in that poem singing, and all of the members singing as they're walking. Just suddenly have this vision of everyone singing as they're walking down the aisles of the co-op, juggling onions, and your imagination go wild in a co-op. Yeah.
How about your responsibilities now as the state poet laureate?
They leave it up to me, which is harder than if they. I wish they would just tell me what to do. But I'm editing an anthology of along with Sid Lee, who was the last poet laureate of Vermont Poets, which should be out next spring. So that's been it's the first one that's ever been done. So that's been a arduous but very enjoyable task. Visiting a lot of schools. Let's see. I've been writing an article for the Valley News and other papers about it once every 2 months. I would love to visit some prisons this summer as well. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Where are you getting poems for the Vermont books?
From Vermont poets, from poets who published a book, one or two books with a reputable publisher, and who've lived in Vermont for significant. They may not be living here now, but either grew up here or lived in Vermont for a significant period of time. There are folks who've lived up here during the summers, for many summers, such as Rachel Haddis, who's here this evening, who's in the anthology. So we're trying to be as open-minded and fair as we can be about it. Yeah.
Whose poems are you recommending or reading right now?
As far as for the anthology,
For yourself.
oh, for myself, that's a great question. I read all the time, so it's. I've just finished judging a contest, so I was immersed in that and discovered a wonderful new poet in that contest. But let's see. Lately, I've been reading. I've been reading a lot of folks. I've been interviewing. I'm doing a new book of interviews, so. I've been reading a lot of Carolyn Frichet lately because I've been interviewing her for about the last 2 years. She has more and more to say. There's a wonderful poet in New York State who's had the honors program there named Stephen Kusisto, whose poems I've been reading and been interviewing him. I've also interviewed Jane Hirschfield recently and have been reading her. She's very prolific. Been reading Rachel Haddis, who's right here. Natasha Trethewey, I've been reading. She did a wonderful interview. Jericho Brown, who's her colleague at Emerson, I've been reading quite a bit. So I've tried to read as broadly as I can. Yeah. They are, they've all, the first book, as Shara mentioned, has been published with those senior poets, and so this new book is much more diverse, and so I think I'm calling it Voices from the Range, and those they've all been published various places. I finished a really wonderful interview recently with James Wright's widow, Annie Wright. Which I think is just terrific. She had all sorts of information that no one knew about him. So that was fun to do. Yeah?
I'm so curious what the truth was.
Oh, you want to know what the truth was? So, I've actually revised this poem a little bit because a friend of mine whose daughter is epileptic, you may know Veranda Porch from Southern Vermont, whose daughter, she very kindly informed me that it's impossible to swallow your tongue. So that was wrong. So I've rewritten it a little bit so that there's a different incident that takes place, but this is what was published. So what actually happened was that he did run up this hill with a knife and threatened to kill the dog, but then, and I followed him, probably like an idiot, and convinced him to drop the knife, which was lucky. He returned back to the main house where everybody was waiting, wondering what had happened, and a policeman had been called. And he faked a fit there and wrestled with a policeman on the floor. And I just remember this kind of cartoon scene of like 30 people wrestling with this policeman and Kenny at the bottom of the pile. And someone just said, "Get in the car." And he ran to our car. We were the only people there with a car. And we suddenly, it was one of those Volkswagen things, do you remember those? And we drove back to Hudson Valley Hospital, and because Kenny was in pretty bad shape at that point. And about 20 minutes later, when he was being admitted, we were sitting there with him in the hospital. Kenny was, and the policeman arrived, ready to arrest all of us for speeding. He had taken the wrong route back to the hospital, so he assumed that we'd go like 90 miles an hour. We had actually gone the speed limit the whole way. And so when we pointed this out to it, then he turned red and just walked out of the room. And but the sad thing was that Kenny did die about 2 months later in the hospital. So I'm thinking, try to find a story here that's, Tim O'Brien is a genius at this, the novelist who wrote The Things That Carry, and he talks about truths that are more true than facts, what he called happeningness. So I changed the story to make it, I hope, more memorable and true in some ways.
Were you aware of any kind of allusion to the story of Isaac?
No, that's an interesting reference, though. What were you thinking of specifically?
It read like that to me.
Uh-huh. Yeah, going up the hill and, right, and the knife.
But it's also,
Yeah,
maybe you're a Leonard Cohen fan. I don't know.
I am. I absolutely
The
am.
whole thing going up to the hill.
Yeah. Well, see, that's what happens in writing,
The intercession.
That's right. That's a good point, yeah.
I thought the same when you even mentioned Israel in that poem.
I do. That's all unconscious. Totally unconscious. But I think you're right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Go ahead, Rich. Yeah.
There's a novel called Tinkers that came out a few years ago about epilepsy, and Paul Harding, who wrote it, whose grandfather was epileptic, makes the point of saying that it's a false folk belief that people could swallow their
Right.
drugs. And a lot of people, it's obviously a very durable legend.
That's right. I don't know why, because it can't happen. That's right.
But I'm just going to comment as a fellow writer. It's called poetic license.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Everybody believes it.
Mhm.
Certainly lead to that if you certainly gave us the epilepsy.
Yeah.
And so that would be the perfect way.
Yeah.
So I would certainly grant myself the right to go against not listening.
Okay. Thank you. It works, I hope, in the story. Yeah.
What was the term Tim O'Brien had?
Happeningness. Yeah, he tells this story in Things They Carried, or How to Tell a True War Story, where a lieutenant falls on a grenade. Do you know this story? And dies. He's trying to save his platoon, and he falls on the grenade. And all of the platoon members die, and he dies. But after he's died, he gets up and turns to the captain and says, "Story of my fucking life." And O'Brien says that's truer than what actually happened. Because suddenly that lieutenant has character and a face and a story. Well, thank you so much. It's been great to be here.